Hi, I'm David Austin, and I'm your host of ThinkTech Hawaii, and today we have the great pleasure of having Trisha Watson with us. Dr. Watson is the CEO of Honua Consulting.
Sure.
The CEO, why don't we say, sure, of Honua Consulting. And we're here today to talk about HEPA, also known as 343, Hawaii Revised Statutes 343. So welcome.
Thank you.
So what's going on with 343 right now?
Wouldn't everybody love to know? That's actually sort of the question on everybody's mind right now. 343, to kind of give the viewers a little bit of background, is our State Environmental Protection Act, and it's really based on the National Environmental Protection Act that was passed by Congress in the 70s. And this law was really created to look at environmental issues. How can we improve environmental protections nationally and then in the state? 343 is probably best known in the, by the public right now as sort of the law that was triggered when the super ferry issue, mess, however you want to do it, debacle unfolded. And what happened with the super ferry litigation and super ferry issues was it really got everybody saying, okay, we need to figure this out. We have a problem in this state with how environmental assessments and environmental impact statements are done, processed, what's going on. So that's the sort of short version of what's happened, and where we're kind of at right now is what's going on with 343.
Great. Now, can you explain for those of us who may not know what exactly environmental impact statement is?
An environmental impact statement is a disclosure document. So what it is when you are considering doing a project, we have triggers in this state. So there are different triggers that will either on a federal level or state level put a project into a category where, by law, they are required to review any environmental impacts that this project may have on its surrounding environment. So that's sort of the short version of what an EIS is. But it is a document that asks the developers or the people, putting the project forward to really go through different elements to assess what kind of impact this project will have on, community, environment, soil, all those different issues. So that's the very short version of what an environmental impact statement is. It's a disclosure document.
And why are we looking again at environmental impact statements and 343?
Well, again, this kind of goes back to super ferry, and super ferry was not alone. There was a lot of litigation that's happened. Actually, over the years, there's just an absolute, there's volumes of litigation that's occurred over how to deal with this law. And why we're looking at it now is there are just questions in the community. 343, when it was first enacted in the 70s, right? So it comes out of these federal laws that actually, a little bit more history, go back to sort of the Rachel Carson era, Silver Spring and those issues when people for the first time really started to wake up to the reality that there are certain things that occur in our communities, in our environments that are very environmentally damaging.
Okay.
So people should know that this really was a large part, a very large part in response to sort of the developing environmental movement that was sort of best known as sort of Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring. So what has happened in 30 years is that we've just had trouble. I mean, it really was time for a tune-up. It's like a car. You have a 30-year-old car, you better take it into the shop.
Right.
And really what we've had to now start to look at much better than we have in recent years are policy issues.
Okay.
Or at least somebody like me, I would advocate that really the issue at hand is a policy one.
Okay.
If these laws, if NEPA and HEPA were really first about forcing a society to look better at how we weigh development and the need for projects in a community versus environmental concerns. Really in 30 years, technology and business and development have evolved so much that we really need to take that step back again and look at how effective is this law in helping us move through those policy concerns, and not just sort of the high altitude policy concerns, but when there are projects like Super Ferry or any other projects that come our way, is this law helping us weigh as a society these different policy interests? So that's kind of, where we are right now with 343 is we're long overdue, quite honestly, for that sort of tune-up where we're looking at these policy considerations again.
Now, the University of Hawaii tried to give, or did give, 343 a tune-up. Could you explain a little bit about the study that was conducted and whether you feel it was necessary or not?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. How's
Okay.
that? Necessary, absolutely. Absolutely necessary. The effort was an interesting one. What happened was there was $300,000 appropriated to the university 2 years ago that mandated a group, or the university, but a certain group in the university, to look at certain emerging issues. So these policy issues, and the emerging issues were things like climate change, disaster management, cultural issues, things that are very new, critical, emerging, and clearly going to be very important in the years to come. It was an interesting effort. I think there were people who had a lot of concerns with how the study was done, and absolutely with the results that we're sort of now seeing. They have proposed legislation, which is a bit interesting unto itself. And that's having an interesting time this year. So is that diplomatic? I'm trying to be diplomatic,
That was very
but be a litigator. Ask your questions.
What was noteworthy or newsworthy about the proposed legislation?
So the new legislation that they're putting out. Well, first, I guess it's important to note that there are people that feel it's very premature.
Okay.
In the sense that there hasn't, and this was sort of part of a lot of the concerns that were raised with the research that was done. There was not a very wide stakeholder community consulted.
Okay.
There was, in fact, a very limited group consulted, which, and clearly something of this magnitude, I mean, Super Ferry is, and again, a perfect example of how wide the impact is. I mean, just really who was not statewide impacted by Super Ferry. So I think there were many people who felt like there needed to be a very open, transparent, inclusive effort that really looked at all these issues, and there are competing opinions as to if that was actually accomplished. And then in a sort of interesting move, if you look at the appropriations bill that mandated the funds, it was really LRB, the Legislative Reference Bureau, that is in charge of this study. It was through them that they contracted the university. Yet the researchers who did the study went directly back to the legislature, introduced legislation without going back through the LRB process. So it's pretty interesting, and in many ways I think very concerning for people that this absolutely, upheaval of 343 has been proposed without really doing a lot of stakeholder input, without really asking particularly the business sector, the technology sector, a lot of the research sector, if this is something that everybody can get on board with. And I think, clearly when you're talking about environmental laws, we haven't always got along very well.
Right,
so
right.
I would think that it would have been prudent to get more buy-in at this point before moving forward. But that doesn't always happen. The world's an
Very
imperfect
true.
place, so what can you do?
Right, well, who was consulted?
A lot of, clearly Department of Transportation was spoken to, my understanding is quite a bit. And largely because this came in the wake of Super Ferry. So
Okay.
really, I think the problem for a lot of people was Super Ferry is really only one agency. It's the Department of Transportation, they're one. 343 applies to everybody, so I think there was a little bit of misguidance in really looking closely at transportation when 343 impacts everybody in every state agency. And so they really talked a lot to them. They talked to some planners. There were some environmental groups consulted. I think what we've seen from testimony that's come forward about the proposed legislation is not many people were consulted. I think there were, as a part researcher, I mean, as someone who also wears that hat sometimes, I think just the methodology that was used, there were, I know people were not allowed to provide written comments during a lot of the, beginning phases of it. The input was consolidated, so you really did not get a sense of if there was opposition, concerns. That really is not set forth practically at all in the report actually where it is now. It's even unclear if the report that has been given to the legislature is the final report or is it a draft report. So there's just a phenomenal amount of confusion at this point, which is incredibly unfortunate, being that the situation was already confusing to begin with. I don't think we've done anybody any favors at the moment. So unfortunately, that's where we are right now. Is, they consulted some people, and they're just kind of, it's unclear as to if everybody who wanted to participate or has an interest in this was really given the opportunities to speak to this issue, very, very critical issue, in a way that, is getting these issues the momentum they need to go forward, because they really are such important issues.
Do you know how the land development community reacted to this? I mean, what would a land developer say to the proposed legislation? What have land developers said to you about it?
I don't know if I can use those words on TV. I think what we saw really, and I know a lot of the business associations have weighed in, a lot of the developer groups have weighed in, and it's just concern. I don't think there is not an ill-intentioned person in the mix. I think everybody is really eager to see progress, evolution in this regard, especially on this legislation. But really what you have seen over and over and over again from the testimony is we want to be included. And I think, that's absolutely fair. Any researcher worth their salt is going to at least, come up with a process and a method that allows people to speak to the issue and weigh in, especially if you're talking about public input, if you're talking about assessing where the community is and what is legislation or a process or an EIS process that people can really get behind. I think if we want things to be able to move forward in an efficient manner, in a timely manner, in a way that's not going to result in endless protesting, let's come up with a process we can all agree upon. So and I really don't think that's too much for anybody to ask.
How does the environmentalist community, if there is such a thing in Hawaii, how have they reacted to first of all, what did they think about the original legislation, and what did they think of this proposed legislation?
I think I clearly can't speak for everybody, but I think everybody understood. It's interesting. It's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, what they have is better than nothing. I think people didn't want to see the environmental protections scaled back or watered down. At the same time, I think people recognize that there needed to be a tune-up. That things, especially things like climate change. Climate change is a huge issue for us here. There's issues about public health. Should we start to look at public health impacts in our environmental assessments? So I think there have been things on the table that we all recognize would be good to have in these disclosure documents. So that's first, sort of where they were. I was very, very surprised to see that there was sort of uniform opposition to the legislation. I really thought, environmental groups would really jump on board, and they didn't. And I think, again, that really speaks to just the poor quality of the research that was done, at least in the stakeholder input. And the fact that what you saw was people concerned that they had not been given opportunity to really be a part of this process, be a part of this report in a meaningful way. So, in a time when we don't have much money in the state to begin with, I just don't know how wise it is to be wasting our money. But, that's sort of, I think, where they are. And I think hopefully that will give the legislature, enough information to really pause on this, circle back and say this needs to be done better. This is too important. There is too much at stake. this needs to be done better.
By this you mean the study?
The study and the legislation,
and the
proposed legislation. I heard today that it did cross over. It passed out of the House today, but we are now in, I think, our third amendment. There's, I know, at least an SD2 already. There's now an HD1 that we're going to see, and to me, that's an indicator that there are some big problems here. And if you're going to take an entire statute and completely revise it, to me, especially one with such massive impact. I mean, impact across the state, projects across the state, industries across the state. We need to be doing it right. It's just too important to make mistakes on.
Can you explain to me a little bit about what exactly the proposed bill is changing?
Well, okay, so assuming, I have not seen the latest version, being that it just passed today, but I think the number one issue that a lot of us saw was a push towards making discretionary actions by state agencies require an environmental assessment.
Okay.
And what this means, it really just translated to sort of layman's terms, is if you are, say, the Department of Agriculture, and I come to you for a permit, it's for anything, I now have to do an environmental assessment as part of my permit to you. And there are many of us who see that as just crippling state business. Right now, there are exemptions to 343. There is a mechanism where if you're going to have a very minor impact, you get exempted out. And the study really attempts to sort of deal with this. They sort of create a new standard of when there's going to be an environmental impact. I think it's very short-sighted. I think it really is. Unfortunately, it seems like academics who have never actually had to deal with a permit or a state agency or been on the ground, being the people really in the mix. I mean, there's just a phenomenal disconnect that I see, that just really no understanding of really what this would mean. And so I think that's part of the concern, is that they've sort of pie in the sky with their vision of this without understanding that it just is not practicable at the end of the day. So I think that's the number one issue a lot of people have right now, is just it's a bit delusional as to what would actually work. And again, that's where better stakeholder input, that's where better, if you saw, they actually did release a draft for public review. It was 17 pages long. The final report was 130. Okay. So to have that sort of thing, it was just sort of irresponsible research, as far as in my opinion.
Irresponsible just in the sense that the report was not extensive enough.
Well, the report is very extensive, but the draft, sort of the process. If you're going to make these recommendations, then really vet them. Go talk to people who will have to implement them. If you put out a draft, put out a very comprehensive draft. Put out the 130 pages and let people respond. Don't submit those 130 pages to the legislature and then everybody gets to scramble to try to find it later. That just is bad practice. We talk about best practices, bad practice. So what can you do?
As a developer, to go forward with the project, is there for example, a size restriction that would be placed on the project so I could be exempted? Or are you saying that because of this discretionary element to the EIS process, that I would, regardless of size, have to apply for an EIS?
That's what it seems like. And again, that's where not having the right people in the mix, not having the on-the-ground people, because that's a very practical question. It would have been nice if it had been answered in the course of this. It's a great question. It's unclear. Because they're trying to create a new standard, the question is nobody knows now. If you just sort of look at the rule, any discretionary action, my guess would be yes, that everybody goes in. And then, and you're an attorney, so you can wholly appreciate when you sort of now created this weird new fuzzy line of environmental significance, that's going to, I mean, we'll be litigating.
It gives us plenty of work.
Yes, we'll be back in 30 years. Discuss. That's right. Attorneys in town should be loving this right now, because this will be litigated out forever. So perhaps the attorney should get on board, because this looks like it'll be making a lot of work for a lot of people. So
now, if I were developing a project and got an EIS completed, let's say I were building 200 homes, what would be in that EIS that the who evaluates the EIS, I guess, first of all, and second of all, what sort of information would they be looking at in the statement?
Well, right now, so again, everything's up in the air at the moment. Anybody's guess what happens next year. There is an authorizing authority. So it would depend. I mean, really, it kind of goes default to the governor and the mayors, depending on jurisdiction issues. And then also agency, like which agency are you working closely, that you are working the most closely with. And again, there's a lot of wiggle room there. So nobody write that down anywhere, because there's administrative rules that kick in as to how that actually sorts out. But again, going forward, a lot of those questions we don't have answers to anymore. And that's what's really frustrating is, like I said, this is a very lovely pie in the sky. But I think those of us in the real world know that unfortunately it doesn't work out that way. The road to hell is paved with great intention, which unfortunately may be where we're headed with this. I mean, I can really, in a time when we need to be enabling developers, we need to be, and not that we want to give anybody carte blanche to anything. I've protested more than my share of things, and I am front and center on environmental responsibility, cultural impact, all these issues. But I'm also pragmatic about we need to be really clear with our needs, our expectation, giving people notice as to what's expected of them, how they can get through a process, and how we can work together. So I think, as a Native Hawaiian who, like I said, owns more than a few red shirts, I am really concerned that you have had people kind of jump out that are really not only not a part of the on-the-ground developing, development or technology community, but really not on the ground with any of the Hawaiian or environmental grassroots groups. I mean, what this does is just people come in just sort of making a mess that the rest of us will have to deal with as they collect their paycheck.
And how does this impact Hawaiian grassroots groups?
That's a really interesting question. One of the issues that they were mandated to look at were cultural impacts, and the study is just it's really almost completely absent. I mean, they just do not do a good job of looking at cultural issues, and not that our state law, our HEPA, the 343, currently requires cultural impact statements. That's something that differentiates it from federal law. This is not required at the federal level. And this is a wonderful mechanism. As a Native Hawaiian, I love this mechanism. I want to see it strengthened. I do think we need to look at cultural impacts. How do projects impact sustenance communities? People who, fishermen, hunters, cultural practitioners. How does it impact access to cultural resources, iwi kupuna, all these things. And really, again, this is where this study and this legislation just misses the mark. There was such opportunity to really get in there, have people roll up their sleeves and help with these issues. Clearly, burial issues are a huge issue in this state. I mean, Walmart, Whole Foods, there's just sort of no end to the laundry list of people and developments that have been impacted. And as someone who believes that's such an important issue, to not have taken this opportunity to provide better guidance, to really strengthen provisions that needed to be strengthened, to clarify things that needed to be clarified. I mean, just what a waste. What a wasted opportunity. So that's, and so I guess to answer I didn't answer your question. Wow, how lawyer-like of me. I don't really see that it does anything. It certainly doesn't help us. I don't think it hurts us. I just think it kind of, it doesn't help, and I wish it had.
Aside from proposing a bill or changing the law, how would you have suggested we deal with 343 moving forward?
I think front and center, what really needed to happen was a conversation between the developer community and the technology community and the environmental community and the Hawaiian cultural community about, okay, we all need to exist here together. We're all in this boat. We're all in this super ferry together, no pun intended. Well, no, I was a very vocal opponent to super ferry. So, I saw this unfolding. How do we, understanding that all these issues are important, critical for the economic well-being of the state, important for the environmental sustainability of our land, how do we create legislation that balances all the things we need to think about? And that didn't happen. That just, that was first and foremost what this should have done. Look at what are our priorities as a society? What are our priorities as a community? It would have been wonderful to bring public health into this conversation. They just weren't. To more meaningfully bring in the climate change community. And we just didn't see that. There was a climate change task force that existed this year. They also had to put recommendations forward to the legislature. I would have loved to seen everybody in one room. What opportunity to just bring everybody together and really hash out what matters to us, to come up with new recitals at the front of this legislation that really laid out what are our priorities. And then from there, through this legislation, really look at, are these triggers the ones and they tried to do that. To their credit, they tried to do that, but I felt like it was a lot of the cart before the horse.
Right.
And so that was really it. That it's like, it's like if you and I just sat in a room together and kind of came up with a lot of this, as opposed to really going out and having a very open process. So another research concern I had was they set their questions beforehand, sort of, instead of just going out into the community and saying, okay, what's going on here? What's wrong here? Tell us. And that, I think we would have seen a very, very different report. I think we would have seen very, very different legislation. And I would have loved to have seen that. I just really think things that really meaningfully addressed climate change, I think that's a huge one. Disaster mitigation. I think in the wake of the tsunami coming, being able to really look at, if we're going to build something, are we really prepared on, for coastal inundation? Are we prepared for all these things that are 2 seconds ahead of us? Sort of the day after tomorrow theory. And I just don't see that this legislation gets us there.
Can you ask her about the Environmental Council?
That's a very good idea. Okay.
I'm not really good on that, so maybe no. Okay, no, go ahead.
Okay. Could you give me a little bit of information about the Environmental Council, their role, and how you see them impacting the future of this bill?
And again, that's a part of what's going on with 341. People don't know. Again, and this is part of, to go back to the point, this is, there is nobody saying this legislation was, the existing statute was perfect. Again, the role of the Environmental Council was one that was really problematic. I think what we've seen over the last few years is their role scaled back, and that's unfortunate. I think this is part of cuts that have come to OEQC under the Department of Health. One thing that the proposed legislation does that I actually think is a good thing is recommend moving the Office of Environmental Quality and Control, which is an attached agency under the Department of Health, to another state agency. Right now they're proposing DLNR. I actually would not have agreed with that. I would have said DAGS, but nothing is perfect. And I think what we saw is just through sort of these pull, the sort of pulling back of funds and support and resources to OEQC, the Environmental Council really and unfairly suffered in that. They have a number of roles. They have administrative roles. They're supposed to look at, various things, policy issues, administrative rule issues, a lot of these exemptions lists that are created. And unfortunately, the Environmental Council has not been given the support it needed to be doing what it should have been doing. I didn't find the existing statutes as problematic under the Environmental Council. It was simply lack of support that was coming to this group under the Department of Health. And that's really sort of an administrative issue. I don't know that moving it to DLNR necessarily improves that. I mean, it may not. I'm not going to speak to sort of the director's roles in this. Another option that I think many of us had also looked at is perhaps making it a sort of standalone agency under the governor.
Okay.
And I think that's also very interesting. But again, and now maybe we should talk about rail. We're seeing, some problems there as well. So again, these are things that I really wish they had sort of unwrapped a little bit better. Is there a way to make this entity, this office, this council more autonomous? Because what we're seeing now is sort of its attachment to administrations is a problem. But is there a way? Is there a way to make them, where they need to be, and that's part of it, where because a lot of it there really wasn't sort of the stakeholder, there wasn't the opportunity to really have great dialogues about this. If we move it here, what happens? Like, let's ask different agencies if they think that will help. Let's ask developers if we think that would be an improvement. And that's really what should have happened. So right now, the council is not, it has certain authorities. Those have been scaled back. The bill really does try to re-empower it, but again, that's a place where I said, the statute was not as broke, and so you're trying to fix something that wasn't necessarily broke. Again, that's a resource issue, and really everybody's strapped for resources right now. So I don't know if they were alone in that, but that's sort of where the council is right now. And they're a wonderful council. I mean, I have to say, I know a few of them, and I've been before them, and they're really a very, very bright, engaged, committed council. So I would really have liked to seen us do a little bit better by them in this report and this legislation. But it'll be a matter of getting them resources. So hopefully that's coming for them, and that'll be something that happens in the future.
Why would the DLNR be selected over other agencies?
Again, I think that's part of that. That's a reflection of who was doing the study.
Okay.
You have environmental groups; they're going to stick it under DLNR.
Right.
And again, there's that disconnect between people who really sort of see this from an academic place, where it's kind of like, oh, they're environmental, stick them in DLNR.
Right.
But really, from an administrative perspective, and what I would argue is the Office of Planning is in DAGs. So in many ways, trying to even merge this in some effective way with the Office of Planning, who has its own permitting processes. That's actually where the climate change task force went, to sort of make government more efficient here. Those are things that, to me, there wasn't really a good explanation for why one over the other, and I think there were many of us who have been administrators and especially had to deal with these particular issues, who really saw better opportunity to move it, if it needed to be moved to the office of, to move it under DAGs and near the Office of Planning. But then again, considering issues of public health, and maybe that people would have liked to have seen public health issues addressed. I'm trying to think the name of it. And I think it's the health impact assessment. I mean, there's a new growing movement in some states and internationally for people to look at environmental from projects, from not only an environmental perspective, but a health perspective.
Interesting.
What does it mean if you're going to put something here? What impact does it have on public health? Had that conversation occurred, and what's ironic is, while this was all happening, I mean, talk about the right hand not speaking to the left, there was a huge conference on public health where these very issues came up. But because there was sort of, like I said, a real lack of engagement, they didn't get into the report. And I was actually at that conference and sort of just shook my head. What a missed opportunity. There are conference proceedings, there's more, you've been to conferences, there's more materials and studies and reports than, you could have filled a room. And it would have been so easy to at least consolidate some of that, even make mention of it, to say that this is a conversation that's going on in our community. And then, we can even look at this moving of OEQC from that perspective,
Mhm.
maybe health is a good place for it.
Mhm.
You know, that's where clean water is. That's, you know,
Right.
so again, you know, just not really being able to put this on the ground and really respond to the very real world, immediate community issues that are attached to this. So,
Mhm.
you know, that's sort of the bottom line.
How did the alternative energy community in Hawaii, wind, solar, photovoltaic, how did they react to this? Do they have any specific?
You know, I don't even know if they knew.
Mhm.
I mean, I'll be very honest. And I'm trying to now recall the report in which I brought it. I didn't even see that they were consulted, engaged.
Mhm.
I know it was a battle to even get the research community
Mhm.
room at the table, and I mean, we really had to pry. There was, and unfortunately, you know, in the conversations I had with some of the investigators on this, there was just not interest. I mean, they really
Mhm.
didn't see how this would impact all these other areas,
Yeah.
and it did. I mean, and I guess, you know, part of it was that we were in the middle
Mhm.
of dealing with 343. You know, we
Mhm.
were there in the thick of things, knowing this study was going on, making just constant efforts to engage and get them to say, look, you got to look at this and sort of, you know, how this will impact so many different industries. And it just sort of fell on deaf ears, unfortunately. So I don't know that, other than through the certain environmental groups or the few planners that were consulted, there was any sort of really meaningful effort to reach out to the renewable energy and the technology and the business sector. And I think if either their silence or the opposition that came in from the builders associations and the business associations is any sort of indicator, I really don't think that's happened.
Hmm.
And you know, this clearly would impact renewable energy projects across the state. You know, I mean, this is, you know, there's a new question. If you're putting up, you know, just a wind turbine
Mhm.
on your property alone, does this, you know, I mean, where
Right.
does this get triggered?
Right.
You know, and typically it's been state lands or state funds.
Mhm.
But if you're going to tap into, you know, a grid
Right.
that's received state money, I mean, so there's just so many scenarios that really have not been thought out
Mhm.
and planned out. And you know, if you're going to, I'm really a fan of incremental, you know,
Mhm.
development. Like, take your first step, see if that works.
Mhm.
Take your second step, see if that works. And that's sort of just good research practice when
Right.
you want to test and go slowly. This just sort of changes everything, and that's really problematic, in my opinion. But
So it's what you're saying is it's sort of almost a draconian measure that they're taking by changing this, that the changes are going to be sharp and sudden, and it's not going to necessarily be close to what exists now.
you know, yes and no. I think there are some things that are being radically changed. I think there are some things that aren't being touched.
Mhm.
And so what impact that will actually have is, and I guess that's the problem.
Mhm.
I didn't see in the study any really good analysis of, you know, this has been done in California, this is the
Mhm.
impact. This has
Right.
been done here, and this is the impact. And I think this is a little bit of ego, you know, trying to
Uh-huh.
come up with the new revolutionary model of environmental assessments.
Mhm.
And again, it looked at, it didn't, you know, I mean, and that's what's so really funny about it. Had they done what they were mandated to do, had they
Mhm.
looked, kind of went, you know, through it A, B, C, D, and answered those questions,
Mhm.
I think it may have been that. I mean,
Mhm.
I think we certainly have the talent and the minds and the passion of a community who could have generated that. And really, my hope at this point is that this is not the end of the process, that the
Mhm.
legislature doesn't kind of just pick this up and run, but instead, you know, if nothing else, requires them to go back to the LRB, perhaps
Mhm.
forms a legislative task force
Mhm.
to, you know, that is not, you know, these academics or these people, but in the legislature, pick people who, you know, are really close to these issues, and then come up with a second report, come up with a better report, you know. I mean, and again, that's why I said it's unclear. You know, there was a lot of, this is the draft, or some people saying this is the final one. So I really hope they take that opening, say it's the draft, even if it isn't, say it's the draft, and have people take this over who know what they're doing, you know, who really are on the ground We have so many renewable energy people. We have developers. We have, there was the Hawaii Science Tech Council looked closely at this. There was some absolutely wonderful opinions that came from their members. Really, that, people who do this all the time.
Right.
Again, going back to the people who are on the ground, who care about the environment just as much as anybody else. I think there is this real unfortunate misconception out there that technology and business hate the environment.
I'd like for you to talk a bit about some of the cases that have happened that are related to 343.
Okay. I think the big one that everybody knows is Super Ferry.
Right.
And really, I think everybody knows I was a very, very vocal opponent to Super Ferry. And not the Super Ferry. My concern was the process, since I think a lot of people saw when I was on the news, the process, and concern about how the process unfolded, and then also the legislation that resulted. And I think Super Ferry is so hard. I mean, really, I think we needed a ferry. I'm not against ferries. I'm not against the Super Ferry. But I think, again, this was a perfect example of really why we need clarification.
Okay.
How we can better do this process. What could they have done better? And that was an issue of certain things were exempted, that people had concerns about the exemptions.
Right.
And I am first in line to say the exemption process needs to be clearer. It's not right now. It's kind of certain things they've exempted. It's unclear as to what. I mean, it's really, this law really does need help. The law needs help. But again, Super Ferry is such a great example of, there were many of us who felt like, had the environmental assessment process kind of been done better out of the gate, we wouldn't have been where we ended up. And so it's almost ironic that a lot of people who were opposed to Super Ferry kind of underwent the same process in doing this study. They kind of didn't do it right up front. Ohana Polly is one I'm a little more familiar with. And Ohana Polly was really a very interesting case. What it was sort of the precursor of this discretionary action issue. There were people who sued over whether or not a state agency, in this case the Department of Agriculture, when they are issuing a permit, when does this require an environmental assessment? And in this case, there were multiple issues. It was NELHA, so it was state lands.
Okay.
There was a environmental assessment that ended up being outdated, which is sort of a Turtle Bay issue. And what happened in Ohana Polly was when it went to the RCA, they ruled that there needed to be an environmental assessment done. Now, this was nobody, sort of for a state agency. So you mean, imagine if you're the poor Department of Agriculture. All of a sudden you're being told your permits require an environmental assessment. And it was kind of like, what?
Yeah.
And it really, again, was just more fuel on this massive confusion. What needed to be happening, when were they required, when were they not required? And in all fairness, environmental assessments aren't hard. Declarations of exemption are not hard. None of this is rocket science. But there was just, and maybe I'm saying it's not rocket science because I have a law degree and an environmental law degree. So to me, it's not rocket science. I imagine for, people who process permits, it's like, what? Just sort of like, what is this madness? And I think Ohana Polly was really the one where the idea that anytime you issued a permit, this could possibly trigger. I mean, this is sort of really, you start to appreciate the magnitude of the impact. And not that it isn't fair. I think if, in these cases, it was importation permits.
Okay.
Looking at what we're importing into the state and closely, will this have an environmental impact? We should be. Those are absolutely questions we need to be asking. And then what we saw after Ohana Polly is, though, where do, sort of these discretionary actions overlap, right? So say you're requesting a permit under one statute, that maybe in the course of requesting that permission, you have to answer those environmental questions. Is 343 still necessary there? And to me, that was exactly the kind of stuff that the study should have looked at.
Right.
Right? So like Department of Transportation, if you're seeking one approval, where does 343 fall into this and how do they interact? And to me, those are questions we still haven't answered. And to me, there will just be more confusion. And I think, this is so important. And my fear is that sort of the way this has been rammed through is just going to create more conflict in the community. It's just going to create more confusion. It's just going to create more dissent. And that doesn't help anybody. Maybe the lawyers, it helps the lawyers, but it helps nobody else. Because all these issues, Super Ferry, Ohana Polly, Turtle Bay, they're all totally valid, important issues. There are huge environmental issues that need to be answered. There are cultural issues that need to be answered. There's, climate issues. And the fact that we're not, really this is perhaps a very large step back as opposed to the leap forward we needed. That's really where we're seeing the problem. And really my fear is that we're just going to see more litigation as opposed to less. So I think for those, like I said, for a lot of people who sort of do this much more often, I think they would have come up with something very different.
So do you think it would be useful, at this point to amend the bill? What specific provisions would you like to put in?
I actually would stop. I would kill the bill. I said, no bill, absolutely not. And go back to the study.
Okay.
And sort of have, I don't know if it's whether the Hawaii Science Tech Council or somebody else. I mean, I would put together I would actually put together a task force at this point. I mean, like I said, legislative task force, part ledge, but really demand places at the table for planners, the business community, the technology community, the renewable energy community, the disaster response, climate change, culture. Put them all at the table. Get them to just really go through this report. Come out with recommendations that have a cross section of people behind them and pushing for them. And I think really that is so possible. I mean, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibilities by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think we need that vetting process, that people who really, administrators, put in people who have to issue permits, put in people that have to go through this. And I think there's so much potential. There's still potential. Fatal optimist. I'm a fatal optimist. So that's really what I'm hoping for going forward. So.
And now you mentioned the technology community. What specifically have you heard from the technology community about this?
Again, not much. There really wasn't. I mean, that was what was so unfortunate. As much, this is a community who, individuals who complain about, oh, you tried to sneak this through, you tried to go around, and that's sort of what they did in the end. And it really was a very retroactive response. There were a lot, I think this was on some people's radar, and other people had no clue this was going on. I mean, also because this wasn't a standalone bill. Remember, the request for the study came through an appropriations bill. So it was, wasn't codified. I mean, this was something that, unless you really were looking for it, you didn't see it. And I think that's where, so the people who did sort of see this train wreck coming, sort of tried to cry wolf on it. And they said things, it weren't, there wasn't a lot of response. And I think now, this really unfortunately is not on people's radar because they weren't included in the process.
I see.
So now I think what will happen should this bill pass is sort of retroactive, like what? What happened here? And I think that's just really where the fear is. I think this really could be phenomenally damaging to the technology community because, again, there will just be lack of, so between the enactment of a totally new law, change in administration, I mean, there is just, this could not be the worst time for all of this, especially in our economy, the way it is right now. What we need is real clarity, like really clear, strong guidance and leadership to figure out how to move projects forward in a way that is environmentally sound, culturally sound, and at the same time really allows people to come in and bring in, projects and opportunities that are going to help our economy and really for technology and renewable energy. That would be so wonderful. I mean, I want to see that move forward. And so I don't know. I mean, there certainly hasn't been support from the technology sector, but some silence and concern as well, I think, but very minimal, nothing loud. So
Possibly because, as you said, the technology community doesn't really know what's going on and could possibly be broadsided by, what's happening.
exactly, in a lot of the legislative briefings I attended from the community sector, as you all know, it's a very active legislative community. This just wasn't on anybody's radar.
Interesting.
And the fact that it sort of came in a sort of ran in sideways, to me, that was a huge concern. As you well know, especially this year, there were so many briefings.
Right.
There were so many just public opportunities for all these different groups to really put on, there's a tech caucus this year, right? There's a technology caucus, there was a technology package. This just wasn't on anybody's radar. And to me, that is a huge flag, just going up on this saying, that to me, that's a sign that perhaps there wasn't the stakeholder input and sort of really the galvanizing the community into this process that there needed to be. So,
what do you think about what's going to happen with this bill? I know what you want to see happen.
What I wanted,
but
I don't
what do you
know.
think is likely?
I really don't know. Like I said, I haven't seen the latest amendment. So I know it was passed today with amendments. It really is only one more committee, which is finance. So I think at this point, we're looking at it potentially passing. And again, it gives me great cause for concern. I don't know. I think what we will find is, because such a small group of people crafted this, and that they're not in any way involved with the people who need to implement it, you are just going to have really a lot of confusion. It'll be a matter of when this goes into effect, what you're looking at immediately, and really, this is not what anybody needs right now to sort of change a process that's been in place for 30 years. Now's not the time. So I think we're looking at some very serious problems, which is so unfortunate because we have so many critical issues.
Right.
As a community, we have rail, that's such an interesting, effort unto itself. And it has such great opportunity for the community. We're talking about a project that's over $1 billion and really has the potential to pull our community and our society out of sort of this economic rut.
Right.
This is just not the time to be sort of the child's plan that's going on. So, unfortunately, I'm not sure what happens. And I would hope if this passes that the governor vetoes it. I think sort of just for the sake of kind of let's keep things moving forward. And not that I want to see. I love the intent. I love the idea. I think it's important, but let's do it right. And I don't think that's an unfair request of the study or of the legislation. And I think really right now, people are trying very hard to make this work. I think that's what we're seeing from the legislature. I think they understand these are critical issues. I think they're working so hard to try to make it work, and maybe they can. Fatal optimist. That's really going to be the theme. I'm a fatal optimist. And I just don't know.
So what is the potential for Hawaii on a global level?
We are so phenomenally well poised right now. Really, we just have this phenomenal ecosystem. We have just so many emerging technologies. Really, I'm phenomenally excited. Again, fatal optimist, very excited. I really feel like we can become a sort of model of global sustainability and productivity. And again, this goes back to why this legislation is so important, why this issue is so important. If we can figure this out on a regulatory level, if we can figure out this statute, if we can come up with process that allows emerging technologies to be everything they can be, and at the same time is environmentally responsible, culturally responsible, is flexible enough to deal with whatever community issue emerges, whether it's shark feeding or rail. Let's come up with a process that really meaningfully deals with our issues, whatever they may be. I really think we have just the potential to just show the world. I'm really one of those. We can show the world how to do this right, how to do technology, business development, environmental sustainability right and effectively, and make it, just economic engines that take care of everybody in Hawaii. And so really that's my hope. I just have had such great hopes for this study, this legislation, my hope is that that still comes to fruition. I think they need different people on board. You know, I mean, I really think there are so many people, particularly in the technology and renewable energy, you know, in the conservation community, who are just so smart, who have such great experience, who can deal with things at very high administrative levels, on legal levels, on scientific levels, and, you know, sort of on the ground administrative process levels that really can make this, just make this great. So again, you know, I'd love to come back in a year and tell you, this is all wonderful, this is all great. I would love to see us come up with a model of regulation that is something we can show off to the world, that we can be really proud of, that we can, instead of, you know, sort of being known for having a process that's phenomenally broken, instead have a process that is incredibly efficient and beneficial to everybody who lives here.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for coming by.
No problem.
Thank you. Aloha.